Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Real Life. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. A month or two back, I put out a set called Wastes of Veldmar. This is the expansion. Defense of Veldmar. If you missed my introduction video, I'll leave a link in the description. So, in Defense of Veldmar, the factions that you were introduced to in Wastes of Veldmar, where the world was facing an apocalypse, a man-made apocalypse, climate disaster, war, all of that. In this expansion, we're looking at invaders coming through a planar breach. So the barriers have weakened between the planes, and denizens of the Far Realm are coming through. There was also a being trapped there named Thune, an Eldrazi Titan, which had been gradually trying to invade Veldmar. But at the end of the last story, the female Dark Elf Scion, Zeldrava, one of the Paxdrad, she was going to investigate the origins of her faction, the Paxdrad, blue, black, green. She went through this portal to the Far Realm, encountered the entity Thune. Thune was far too powerful for her to face alone, but she was able to read Thune's mind enough to realize that Thune had a fear, and the fear was being found out and discovered by the other denizens of the Far Realm. So in order to save herself, to distract Thune from destroying her, she put out a mental broadcast of Thune, his position, or its position, what it was doing, and just giving away this information about how Thune was going to try to travel through the portal and conquer this world. And sure enough, the denizens of the Far Realm were interested, but this sparked an invasion of her world, Veldmar. The Far Realm just seeks to expand. It's kind of this unthinking, unchecked growth, like constant knowledge, constant progress, constant growth, constant chaos. The mana color white is unknown to them. I went over this in the previous video, but Thune is colorless. So these colorless cards represent the nightmare aspects of the Thune Titan Eldrazi. And Thune likes to manipulate the minds of others. Thune likes to collect a resource called Quintessence. You can see it on the card. And to manipulate minds, work through dreams and nightmares. Anyway, today I wanted to do a card discussion, sort of like some preview cards / design stories, before I just, card by card go through the entire set. Coruscating Pulse is a neat card. I'm playing around in the space of the sideboard. So there's only been a couple of cards in Magic that deal with like the beginning of the game. There is a Serum Powder, I think it was, that can exile your hand and you get a free mulligan if you reveal the Serum Powder from it. Well, this card can come into your opening hand once the game has started. It happens at the beginning of your first upkeep. So first you finish your mulligans, keep your hand. Once you get to your first upkeep, you can reveal a Coruscating Pulse from your sideboard. And no matter how many Coruscating Pulses you have there, you can only put one of them in your hand. You exile a card from your hand and you put the Coruscating Pulse in. And what the card does, it's 2 mana. One of them has to be colorless. You gain 2 life, you surveil 1, you create a Quintessence token. You can either sack it for colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and sack it to draw a card. So this is just a little card that smooths out the game a bit for you. It doesn't have a major game impact. I didn't think that giving you access to one copy of this at the start of the game was necessarily all that powerful. You have to have access to colorless mana, and sometimes you won't want to use it. Sometimes you'll like your opening hand well enough you don't want to replace one of the cards with this. But it could make some unplayable hands that have like one too many lands in them a little bit more playable by exiling one of those lands and you pull in this Pulse. And it gives you a little boost of mana with the Quintessence token. It gives you a Surveil to try to draw into what you want. It doesn't have a big game impact, but it's just enough of a little useful effect that sometimes you might choose to bring it in from the sideboard on your first upkeep. I thought it was neat without necessarily breaking the game. It's definitely a dangerous place to play around in. I get why they haven't printed more things like Serum Powder, or cards like this one. I think done very cautiously and in very small amounts, it can be an interesting design space, but you can't visit it too often. Or some of the core randomness of the game starts to break down. This is Thune, the Mind Unraveled, the Eldrazi Titan we were talking about. So you can see it's an Eldrazi Nightmare. That's on theme with Thune and its sort of semi-reality, pseudo-reality, where it likes to play around in the space of illusion and dreams and thoughts. Thune's 13/13 for 11 mana. About what you'd expect out of an Eldrazi Titan. When you cast the spell, you gain control of 2 target permanents. That's strong. I think one of the Ulamog's exiles 2 permanents. Clearly this is more powerful, because you're actually gaining them. Annihilator 3, Menace, Reach, Ward, Banish 11. That means if you target it, you have to exile the top 11 cards of your library. All of that's pretty straightforward. Whenever an opponent would draw a card, instead, you banish 1. And that player may play the exiled card as long as it remains exiled. Now, this seems pretty weird at first read. You're thinking, what? I'm replacing all of my opponent's draws with my own library? Yes, and that should benefit you a lot more than it benefits them. Their deck has their own game plan, their own strategy to win. And you just totally cut them off from that, unless they're able to directly put cards into their hand without drawing them. Every card draw now is coming from your deck. And that's not the strategy they were ready to employ. Your cards might be too expensive for them to cast, or they might need to hit some of your land drops before they can play the right colors. This could trip them up in a lot of ways. At the same time, at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent banishes 2. Exiles the top 2 of their library. You may play the cards exiled this way as long as they remain exiled. So not only do your opponents only get to play off of your library, you get to play off of your library and their libraries. And since you're taking cards from them 2 at a time, there's some risk of you milling out with all of your opponents drawing off your library as well as you, but you are taking 2 cards away from your opponent's libraries at the same time. So you're kind of keeping pace a bit with what they're doing. And you get access to all of these cards and all of this card advantage. You get to play with their minds and their libraries, and they are forced to play with your library, your mind, what you want them to be doing. This is the sinister aspect of Thune, where it traps you in this living nightmare, where now you're doing what Thune wants you to do, and Thune gets access to all of your resources. We've got some reprints from older sets here. This is Dazzling Beauty. I think it came around Visions or sometime in there. So these are cards from an era when cantrips worked by drawing a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. Sometimes we call those slow trips now. And I chose to revive this because Veldmar is a place where life is harsh and it's not as easy to be rewarded. I still wanted cantripping cards to be in the set, but I felt like this delayed trigger was interesting. It also gives a little bit of a puzzle to the player who's in Quelnai. That's blue, red, and green, where they want to draw cards. They have a theme of card draw matters. And with these cards, they need to plan ahead a little bit about whether they want to trigger it on their own turn or on the opponent's turn. Anyway, this isn't the world's most powerful card or anything, but I think it does a fine job of, replacing itself with a card, giving you a little bit of a fog-like sort of protection. Just don't pick a trampling creature. A trampling creature can just trample right past your non-existent blocker. I just wanted to bring up Flanking Gorillas to say these guys are going to be a beating in Limited. So Flash Lifelink 1/1 for 2 is no big deal, but the enters the battlefield trigger of giving something +2/+2, which can be themselves, that is a big deal. That is a Flash Lifelink 3/3 blocker if you need it. They can also flash in on your turn to be a combat trick. Plus it gives you a body that hangs around after the combat trick is done. I think this card is going to be really strong in the limited environment of defensive Veldmar. Even though aggro may not be the best strategy, the trickiness of this card and the way you can gain advantages from it, I think, are going to pay you dividends. And if there was a deck that could be aggressive, it probably would include this card. Alien Impulses. So I wanted to bring up these control magic effects here and the mana cost that I put on it. So a lot of things in Magic have gotten more powerful over time. It's a concept people are pretty familiar with, power creep. Not everything has, though. Control magic type effects and reanimator type effects, those have not gotten more powerful over time, generally speaking. To this day, some of the strongest and best cards that do those effects are the oldest ones. So in Limited, the original control magic effect where it was 4 mana, and you gain the enchanted creature, that can not only be a removal spell, it can also add a board presence for you, and if the creature was untapped, it could give you a blocker at the same time. It's such a ridiculous tempo swing. So they've been finding ways around this with control magic variants in recent times. There was one in the Innistrad sets where you had to sacrifice a creature in order to cast it. Or they put out one in Bloomburrow where it taps the creature. Even if you give the gift with the card, which I think is like drawing a card, or maybe you have a tapped fish. Even if you give the gift, it still taps the creature. If you don't give the gift, it has 3 stun counters on it, I believe. So those are what they're printing for this at 4 mana now. But I was wondering, what would it cost at a fair rate for blue to get this removal spell that could take their best creature and you could use it right away and you could even block with it? It has summoning sickness when it changes ownership, so you can't attack with it that turn. That's why all those red cards that steal the opponent's creature give them haste. But if you stole an untapped creature with this, you could block with it. And I hemmed and hawed between 6 and 7 mana. To be on the safe side and to just print it as an uncommon, I went ahead and went with the higher mana cost of 7. I think the Veldmar sets, Wastes of Veldmar and Defensive Veldmar, are slow enough that you will be able to employ your 6 and 7 drops. There are ways to accelerate mana, to cast spells early. And these tend to be sets that go a bit defensive and go a bit bigger. I think this set, Defensive Veldmar, has a more aggressive slant than the previous set, Wastes of Veldmar. There are more creatures that have higher power than toughness in this set. So, but that being said, I still think, depending on your deck, you could easily get up to 7 mana and start playing this card, which should be a giant bomb, a huge tempo swing on the game, and I don't think 7 mana is too much to ask. Authentication Drone. This is the kind of card that Wizards does not like to print these days, and that's because it discourages attacking. So we've got a 1/4, 3 mana flash flyer, artifact creature drone, and whenever it blocks a creature, that creature's controller banishes 2. They exile the top 2 cards of their library. So the risk here is, A, you could get blown out with a bad attack rather, that you didn't know was going to be a bad attack until you learn the format a little better and you can suss out maybe if they have this card in their hand. Once it's on the board, it also punishes people for just running, say, a 2/2 or a 3/2 or whatever into it. Because if you can't play a combat trick and trample on past it or kill it, whatever, then it's going to punish you by milling you out over the course of the game every time it blocks. I think Ravnica had a card like this, Bell Tower Sphinx. So, in moderation, these kinds of cards can be interesting. There's another one we'll touch on later when we get into artifacts that are colorless. If you do it too much, the game can stalemate to where the right play is not attacking, which isn't always the worst thing, as long as there are late game cards that are going to bust up and win the game. Like Rise of the Eldrazi was a battle cruiser magic set where the game gummed up in the early and middle part, and then in the late game, people had these giant plays, whether they were auras or equipment or level up creatures or the Eldrazi, that they could then use to break through the stalemate and win the game. And these sets have those big kind of effects in them as well. So I don't think this would cause the game to drag out infinitely, but it might drag it out a little bit. And maybe that's okay once in a while. So I've been playing around with equipment that can go on the opponent's creature. Last set, there was a Berserker Axe that could force your creature to attack every turn, if able. It also gives it haste. The haste part is a reason why you might equip it to your own things. But it can also go on to the opponent's creatures to try to force them into attacking. This is Compliance Rake. So in this case, the equipped creature loses all abilities. It's a colorless 1/1 construct named Servitor. And when it first comes in, you can attach it to a creature an opponent controls. You can also pay 7 at sorcery speed to attach it to another creature an opponent controls. You can also equip this for 1. Now, why you would ever equip this for 1, there's a couple of things in the set. There are 0/1 defenders, little wall tokens. If you equipped one of those walls with this, it would lose defender, it would become a 1/1, and suddenly it would be a valid attacker. There's one or two other corner cases like that, where you might decide it was in your favor to equip your creature up. Most of the time, though, this is an offensive piece, like an aura. Now that's going to nullify an opponent's creature, and occasionally you can move it around for a lot of mana. Random polymorph is just a fun idea. So rather than taking cards off the top to try to replace it with an actual creature card, instead you exile an artifact or creature and then you make them a token at random. And this means it doesn't matter what the composition of their deck is, that this card has its own self-contained random output. That's fun in its own way, too. I think the original polymorph is more of a combo piece, whereas this one is more fun to probably aim at the opponent's creature. But once in a while, if something of yours is going to die anyway, then you could use this in response, kind of roll the dice, and see if you can get the 4/4 flyer. So if this was a normal Magic release that went to the public, this might be one of the most contentious cards of the whole set. Broken Dreams. It is very simply target opponent discards a card at random. It is precisely half the effect of a Hymn to Torok. Half the mana cost, half of the net result. Hymn to Torok is an absurdly strong card. One of the, probably the very best card out of Fallen Empires. And something which has been a plague to Eternal formats ever since it was first printed. That and Mind Twist. So, when it's only a single card, and you're not netting any card advantage, right? You're not getting rid of more cards of theirs than of yours. Then is this card still a problem? This is still going to randomly screw some people over by making them discard a land and making them miss a land drop in the very beginning of the game. And in that regard, people are probably going to hate it. Or it'll randomly take the card that they needed and effectively act like a Thoughtseize once in a while. You know, majority of the time it just takes something that wasn't that relevant, but once in a while it hits exactly the card you didn't want to get rid of. People hate random discard. So why would I bring it back? Well, A, there's a theme of randomness in the set. This card can actually trigger other cards from the Far Realm faction. Blue, black, red, green, everything but white. But also, once in a while, I think it's good to shake things up and bring back things like land destruction and discard or counter spells, things that people hate to play against. But they are counterbalances. They are countermeasures that exist in the game that can hold other strategies in check. And just because people don't like them doesn't necessarily mean they're not healthy for the game at times. This one being a one-for-one exchange, I think it's not going to be too busted. I think people will still hate the card, but I don't think it's going to be overpowered. Demonic Dealings. So I very easily could have made this strictly better than Phyrexian Arena. And it cost 3 black pips. So technically speaking, even if it had a mode of draw a card, lose 1 life on it, costing 3 black instead of 2 black and 1 still wouldn't make it quite exactly strictly better. It'll just be mostly better. But I'm a little tired of cards that are strictly better. I think there's been a lot of power creep in Magic. And so I thought it would be more interesting for the main mode on this card, the main draw of it, to be the Tutor, where as long as you can pony up 7 life and 7 cards off the top, then you get to Demonic Tutor. You get to do that every upkeep as long as you can keep paying. And if that becomes too costly, then at some point you have the other mode. You draw an extra card, lose 2 life, which is still not nothing. But I think it's a good enough mode that as long as you are playing with some life gain, life drain type of things in black, you're going to be able to offset the life it's costing you. If you're using the tutor mode, you can specifically be tutoring cards that can keep the gravy train going, where you're able to gain a bunch of life off the card that you tutored, which can let you tutor again, etc. I think it's a neat card. I'm not sure how powerful it is. It's definitely playing around in a dangerous space, doing multiple tutor effects every turn. But I think the kind of cards you have to fetch to offset this cost are probably going to keep this card in check. Wanted to mention Manifested Depravity real quick here. So this can be a 1/2 Flying Death Touch lifelinker for 1 black. Or it can be a Vampire Nighthawk at 3 mana that also makes you a Quintessence token. And those aren't just like clues, they can also be sacked to make colorless mana. And it goes up from there. And you can play it for 5, you can play it for 7. And the creature you get is less and less efficient, but the Quintessence tokens are kind of making up for that. I believe this is a pretty strong card. Between the flexibility that it has, the fact that it has lifelink and death touch and flying, I think overall this card is a pretty strong package. Rites of Sacrifice. So this one, you can do the 2 mana instant, sack a creature, draw 2 cards. We've seen that before. But then you may also, or in addition to, or separately from the creature, you may sacrifice an artifact, battle, land, or planeswalker and pay 4 life. If you do, you draw a card. Now, this second mode you probably wouldn't want to cast unless you were truly desperate, without playing the first mode as well. The first mode is the one that's getting you card advantage. The second mode would be a terrible, terrible cycling effect. But you can also do both of them. You can sacrifice a creature and an artifact, battle, land, or planeswalker, and pay 4 life, and draw 3 cards for 2 mana. And that could make this card possibly busted. Now, having to come down on 2 permanents and 4 life is not nothing. But the card is modal to where you don't always have to do that. You can choose to do just the creature, you can choose to do both, or you can choose to do just the artifact, battle, land, or planeswalker in 4 life. I think this card is neat. I think it is definitely playing around on the edge of being too powerful. But the cost of 2 permanents and 4 life, I think, is going to hold it in check. But it's a serviceable card just to sack a creature and draw 2. And then some of the time you'll get the full mode on it. Umbral Maze. I like how the AI art came out on this one. So I had this concept to do a maze of nightmares. So we have this nightmare wall here. It's got Defender. It can sack creatures to put +1/+1 counters on itself and gain 1 life. And eventually it gains lifelink, trample, and it can attack, as though it didn't have Defender, as long as it has 4 or more counters on it. They don't have to be +1 counters. 4 counters of any kind. So, you know, if you put, I guess, like a Menace counter, a Death Touch counter on it, or something like that, then it could attack with just 2 +1/+1 counters. This is a neat sacrifice outlet. It's a defensive piece early and a win condition late. Turns on well for an aristocrats type of deck. And helps to offset the damage raise blunt and early offense with its toughness and also with a little bit of life gain, and eventually with lifelink. I think this card's neat. I think there have been better cards like this that have been printed in Magic, but I really enjoy the way that this one came out. I think it would play well. So every color has a mana filter card of some kind in the set. In this case, they're all different. 4 of them are part of a cycle with the Far Realm, but because the Far Realm is based on chaos, each one of the 4 works differently. They're all 3/1s except for the blue one, which is a 1/3. And the way that the red one converts is adding the mana at random. You can activate it only once per turn. The card looks terrible. I mean, a 3/1 for 2 is playable, of course. So, as a mana filterer, it's extremely unreliable. The reason you would run this card if you're in the Far Realm is because the activation happens at random. And that random word being in there, in the rules text, triggers other cards that the Far Realm cares about, where you might be able to breach. You know, get a free land or spell after you shuffle your library and reveal the top card. Things like that. There are payoffs for being random or flipping coins. So I wanted to let you all know that that's the real purpose of this card. If you're relying on it to fix your mana, it's not going to do a great job of that. But if you're relying on it to trigger random effects, it's great at that. Midnight Brainstorm is a card I think that's going to be amazingly good in Limited, and could see play in Constructed. Interesting thing about making a block for Veldmar, there will be a 3rd set coming, is you could play block Constructed again. That's a term that probably modern Magic players have no idea what it means. It basically just means you play only with the cards from within the block. It's like its own little mini standard. It had problems. Sometimes there would be a deck that would run away with the format and there weren't enough answers and countermeasures to offset it. Block Constructed wasn't perfect, but it's another way to play the game. There'll be an option with Veldmar. But anyway, so this is a 2-mana instant. You can discard a non-land card. If you do, you shock something, 2 damage to any target, and you draw 2 cards. Because it's not an additional cost to play the spell, if someone counters it, you're not out anything other than the Midnight Brainstorm. You do have to discard a non-land card, but at least you got to shock something for doing so. This is kind of like a mini Hypothesizal that's only in red. So it does it the red way, where you have to do the rummage effect. You have to discard the card first. Hypothesizal has blue, so you get to draw the cards first before you do the thing. But this is more aggressively costed than Hypothesizal. Hypothesizal is 5 mana for 4 damage. This is 2 mana for 2 damage, and then is a much more relevant point in the curve. Orc Marauder, the reason I bring this card up, I mean, it's got 2 modes that it can do, right? So you can play the beatdown route, where it gets haste and menace until end of turn, and then it gets a +1 counter at the beginning of the next end step. Or you can go a more mid-rangey route, kind of a ramp mid-range. You make a treasure token, you exile the top card of your library until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. So that's the value route. Then the other route is the beatdown route. Part of what I find interesting is this design where I give it the haste and menace until end of turn, but it doesn't get bigger until the end step. So it's not immediately a 4/4, but it can attack as a 3/3, and then it grows. I don't recall seeing any designs by Wizards that are like this exactly. Could be a little bit of an interesting new design space where you've got a tension between what the card can attack as now and what it gets a bonus as later. It could be just a little bit of number tweaking you could do if you think that coming in as a 4/4 with haste is a little too strong. Then it's not a 4/4 till the following turn. Red has a couple of these modal spells, like Roka Tool Blast. Now, part of this was trying to get cards that could serve multiple functions in the set, because, space is pretty tight when you're designing a set, especially with 9 different factions at the same time. But another part of it was that there are these cards in red that are meant to be from guilds that are like problem solvers, like artificers, people who kind of have a tool for every situation. So for those reasons, I came up with some modal spells, and this one feels like it's part of a charm cycle, like the old charm cycles where they cost like 1 or 2 mana, and they give you 3 or 4 things they can do. None of them are worth a card on their own, but when you add them all together with the flexibility of the card, it's pretty decent. This is in that mode. So mode 1, it can deal 3 damage to a battle or a token creature. Battles are in this set. So you can use it to help you flip a battle, or you can blast away a token. And, those could be okay. Target artifact gains indestructible until end of turn. Niche application, much better if you have artifact creatures in your deck, which Roka is likely to. Target creature gets +1/+0 and trample until end of turn. Again, it's not really a good enough combat trick at 1 red, but just having it as a mode they have access to on the card probably is fine. Then you can draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. And that makes this card useful for Quel'Nai College, where they want to be able to trigger extra card draws to turn on their payoff cards. So this card has a bunch of different utility that it can do. None of them would be maybe quite good enough on their own, but added together, I think it's going to be a pretty useful card. Dichotomy Mage is a card that wears a bunch of different hats, not just a wizard's hat. So this little 1/1 for 2 banishes 2. You exile the top 2 of your library, which that can actually turn on some things for the Zarnik Collective. White, blue, green. It also makes a trash token that's good for the Zarnik or for Roka. Right? White, red, green, they care about artifacts. And a Quintessence token. Quintessence is useful. It can ramp your mana, can replace itself with a card draw. Or, if you have the colorless only cards in your deck, then this can help enable that strategy as well. So this is just one of those little 2-drops in the set that helps smooth things out. I don't think you can run like 5 or 6 of them. At some point, you need cards with real stats, and banishing that many cards would be maybe not the best. Gift of Lore. This is one of the trickier green cards. So you're tempting the opponent with the ability to take the best card out of their top 7. They have to exile the other 6, though. If they do that, then you've got to draw 3 for 4 mana at sorcery speed. If the opponent doesn't want to play, then you get to surveil 3 and draw 2 cards, which is still not bad. I'm not sure how it would fare in constructed. Sorcery speed stuff has to be pretty strong most of the time. But there could be a kind of control deck, mill deck, that could use this as card draw, and sometimes tempt the opponent into banishing, where that would play into your strategy to mill them out. I like this card. I didn't think of it at the time, but the art has an echo of like Vraska and Jace. I wasn't intending that, but I'm okay. with it being like an echo of them. It's just AI generated art of this guy trying to do an exchange for knowledge from this green aligned Gorgon witch. I thought about reprinting this card. I seriously considered it. I was looking at all the old cards that draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, and I very seriously considered reprinting Pie Knight. But ultimately I decided I needed something that played into the synergies of the set a little bit more. So, unfortunately, we've had to power creep Pie Knight in this case. I feel okay about it because, you know, Ice Age came out about 30 years ago. And I think it's okay to power creep a card that's 30 years old. So, we've got Trash Raider. This is a Goblin Rogue. It's a 1/1 for 3. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token and a trash token, and you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So, it harkens back to Pie Knight, but it makes you 2 artifact tokens. You can play into food synergy themes from other sets, you know, like Wilds of Eldraine and stuff. Gets the trash token that plays well with Zarnik Collective. The artifacts play well with Roka, and just this package of value also would play pretty well with Aristocrats. That would be the Nulvir Cult. It's white, black, and green. So there are a number of different decks that could make use of this little guy. Just kind of another glue card, holds the format together, chomping on burgers, you know. Violent Retort, I think, is going to be an extremely good limited card. Possibly so good it sees constructed play. So it's an instant, first off. It's 2 mana. You can have a creature you control fight a creature you don't control, which would not be that exciting even at 1 mana. It'd be okay at 1 mana. But it has this other mode, where it's a combat trick. Target creature gets +3/+2 and trample until end of turn. The fact that you get a fight and a trample pump on the same card, that makes it pretty flexible. The pump is good enough. You know, red uses pump effects like that anyway. And the fight effect gives you removal. I wouldn't be surprised if some number of it turned up in a constructed format. And in limited, I think it's going to be really, really solid. So this is the kind of card that exemplifies what the Consortium is all about. The Consortium is splashy. They go big. They're kind of excessive. And they like to dominate with these showy displays of magic. So, when I was choosing how to balance this card, I balanced it against the big Strixhaven Mythic in blue-red. The one that can tap things down, deals damage, creates a 4/4, that card. You can channel it to get treasure, or cycle it, something like that. This costs 1 more mana than that card, and it costs more colors of mana. So I think it's fair to make this one stronger. So this is kind of following in the vein of giant powerful spells like Cruel Ultimatum and things like that. I think it's fun. I think it's a fun spell. It's something neat to try to build your game towards or build your deck around. Either tricking it somehow for free to cast it or just ramping into it. Battles are back. This one's pretty strong. It's a 6 mana spell. They're all sieges, just like the ones from March of the Machine. And when it comes in, you create a 3/3 colorless golem, and then you deal X damage to a creature where X is the number of artifacts you control. So, as long as you're playing into what the Roka deck wants, It's not just going to be like a ping for one. You know, if you have 4 or 5 artifacts in play and the golem gets to count towards that number, then you're going to kill probably the opponent's best creature. Then you can attack this down. It has 5 defense, and it flips into the wrought iron golem. Again, Rampage is back. It's especially good on big trampling creatures because now it becomes more difficult to gang block them with 2 or 3 things. And it has the ability to sacrifice an artifact and put counters on itself. This is another way you can get a payoff for having the artifacts matter theme. There are a lot of tensions that are built into these sets. This one wants to eat away at your artifacts to keep getting bigger, whereas other cards want you to maintain a high number of artifacts for their ability. It's up to you how you want to weigh the scales on that balance. This is another one of the chaotic cards from the Far Realm. I mentioned earlier that Zeldrava ventured to the Far Realm. This is one of those moments where she's crossed over and she's having all of these horrible revelations about the nature of reality and existence. As far as what the card does, it's a neat card draw spell. So it's an instant for blue, black, red, green, everything but white. So you exile the top 6 cards of your library, banish 6, and then you flip a coin 3 times. As long as you win at least 1 flip, you're going to put 2 of the exiled cards in your hand. But if you win 2 flips, you get 4 of them. If you win 3 flips, you get all 6. Then if you control planes, you discard 3 cards. It's one of those guardrail mechanics where I'm trying to get people to be into 4 colors, but not into 5. I'm just trying to put a little bit of guidance into the format to give some color identity to these 4 color groupings, because it's hard to give them a strong identity. So I think you enforce that by whatever means necessary. So yeah, I like how the art turned out on this card. I think the effect is neat. It's possible it's good enough to see constructed play, which I'm sure tournament players would despise. They hate essentially random cards like this, but as long as you win at least 1 of your 3 coin flips, you get to look at the top 6 and put 2 of them into your hand. That's pretty good. That is some good card selection that comes with card advantage. If you win 2 of the flips, then the card's just amazing. That is so much value. And the outlier scenarios where you win 3 flips or you win 0 flips, I think don't happen very often. They'll happen some amount of the time. But, you know, maybe because the floor of the card is you draw nothing and exile the top 6, that would give some people a reason not to play it. But maybe other people would see the upside or play the averages. And this could be an important card draw spell, maybe for a control deck. So here is Seldra, Nulvir Marauder, and when the AI first spat out this art, I was a little stunned. This is an incredibly beautiful piece of art. I didn't even have to edit it very much. Now, some of these pieces I have to do more work to clean up the AI art, like add a finger, remove a finger, delete some tentacles and things. I probably had to do a little bit of that on this piece, but really, it pretty much came out looking great. Anyway, the card is also a good, strong card. Let's take a look. So, she is in the Nulvir cult colors. White, black, green, and 1. Now, she's a 4/4 for 4. She's mythic. Seldra has Death Touch, Lifelink, and Menace. When she enters, you may sacrifice a creature, and if you do, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature. So, as long as they've got a non-token creature, you're going to hit something relevant, probably. And whenever you sacrifice a creature, You return a non-creature permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. It only triggers once each turn. But this means when she first comes down, you can sack a creature, all your opponents sack a non-token thing, and then you get a non-creature permanent card from your graveyard back to your hand, with the potential to do more of that in the future. I think this card is probably constructed playable. Probably really, really good in a kind of mid-rangey aristocrats sacrifice style deck. And again, the art kind of floored me. So this is Xyliris, cryptozoologist. He's with the Quelnai College. That's blue, red, and green, and the colorless. And it's a 2/4 Gorgon wizard. He's the only male Gorgon that I've got in the set at the moment. He's got Death Touch, Haste, and Vigilance. Can't be blocked by creatures that share a creature type with a creature you control. That's kind of the cryptozoologist aspect of the card, where he cares about creature types. Is if he's seen it before, it can't defend against him. And he has tap draw a card. And sometimes I think you should just go back to basics. Keep it simple. Right? So he can attack. He can sometimes get through unblocked. And he has Vigilance and Haste. So he can do all of this the turn he comes down, and at the end of the opponent's turn he can tap and draw you a card. Or in response to a removal spell. So just a really solid package of abilities without being overly complicated. The Planeswalker for this set is Zeldrava, the same one who crossed into the Far Realm and back. So in the previous set, it was established that the Raven Man, spoilers, he's Limdul the Necromancer. This is why he has momentarily given up on Liliana, and he's taken an interest in Zeldrava. Somehow or another, he discerned or sussed out that she had the Planeswalker Spark. And so between the power that she possessed as a Scion and her Planeswalker Spark, he decided to approach her and try maybe a little bit softer approach, a little kinder approach than he tried with Liliana. And so far, Zeldrava has tentatively been willing to work with him, without fully knowing who he is. But anyway, this is where her spark has ignited, and she has stepped into this is supposed to be, you know, a more modern city. I was thinking of Cyberpunk. Like if we were able to zoom out the art more here, you would see some neon signs. You'd be able to tell clearly that it's raining. As it is, it looks like it could be Cyberpunk or any modern or slightly futuristic looking city. But it's kind of supposed to be Kamigawa. So she is a 3-mana walker. She's got 4 loyalty. She can +1 to make a 1/1 blue illusion creature, but it has at the beginning of your upkeep sacrifice this creature. So usually you lose the token. Maybe sometimes you can sacrifice it for value, or you could make the token and then equip it with the card we looked at earlier that removes all of a creature's abilities, makes it into a 1/1 artifact. If you made one of her illusion tokens and equipped it with that thing, it would hang around. But normally this is just sticking around long enough to block on the opponent's turn and then be gone on your next turn. -2, target opponent banishes 3, so let's exile the top 3 cards of their library. You choose one of those cards. You may play that card as long as it remains exiled. This is kind of what Zeldrava, her card, does. As a Scion, she mills them out, but she's also like modifying and editing and stealing their memories and implanting new memories. So it makes sense that she's taking something away and able to use it from her enemy. And then -3, target opponent puts 2 cards from their hand on top of their library, then that player may banish 7. If you're wondering why the player would ever choose to banish 7, you can get locked. You can get soft locked by having cards returned to the top of your library if you're not able to scry past them, surveil past them, draw past them. Then if you can keep getting hit by effects like this, you can get locked from ever seeing new cards, which can, for instance, prevent you from hitting your land drops. If you couldn't play anything last turn on 3 lands, then chances are if you just had to put 2 cards in your hand back on top of your library, you're at least 2 more turns off from seeing that land again. Which is why the banish 7 option is here. The opponent has the chance to see new cards that way. But if they choose to do that, they're playing into her other win condition, which is milling out the opponent. So it's a bit of cruelty either way. And, you know, a tournament player or whoever would tell you that it's not good to give your opponents choices. That always, gives them the advantage in that situation, etc., blah, blah, blah. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to offer choices like this, regardless of whether it is more mechanically powerful. And it's basically a discard too, but the cards don't go to the graveyard. So it's a pretty punishing ability. And she has enough loyalty to do any of these when she first comes down. So, Ancient Prism. This card is not great, but this card is also not terrible. Let's talk about it for a second. So, 2 and tap to add 1 mana of any color. We're more used to filtering 1 for 1. Cards that filter 2 for 1 are usually considered kind of junk. You only run them if you're desperate. Like I remember, was it March of the Machine? They had like Urn of Godfire or something, where you could pay 2 to filter mana. But that card you could also sack it to destroy something. This, on the other hand, costs 0 to get out. So it costs you a card, but it doesn't cost you any tempo. If you were playing the Storm deck, for example, then this is a spell that adds to your Storm count. It doesn't detract from your mana. It does detract from your cards in hand. And then later, after you've been playing a bunch of mana spells and trying to like card draw and cantrip and filter your way through your deck, maybe you get hung up at some point where you've got too much red mana and you desperately need to cast something else to be able to win the game. You could actually use the Ancient Prism, even though it's not very efficient, even though you probably have other cards that you've been hitting in your Storm that would allow you to do so. You have this 0 mana spell that added to your Storm count that still could maybe have the option of fixing your mana when your Storm is ready to go off, or to keep it going. In terms of how playable a card like this is, costing 0 and getting it down, it takes the same amount of lands tapping as those common lands they've been making recently, where you can tap for colorless or you can pay 1 and tap to filter the mana. That technically costs you 2 mana, because you have to tap that land not to make its normal mana. So you're tapping 1 land plus that land, tapping 2 to get 1. This is the same ratio. And people do play those cards. Now this is not also a land, but it could also be handy for someone like Roka that cares about the number of artifacts they control. I guess what I'm saying is this card isn't as bad as it looks. And when you get all the way back into Eternal formats and such, there's a possibility Storm decks and things would have a use for it. So I wouldn't discount it, even though it takes 2 mana to do the filtering. Doom of the Tolgath. So this card is like a love letter to the giant old creatures of yore. You know, the stuff they would print like 25 or 30 years ago. I'm thinking of creatures like Leviathan, Polar Kraken, Marjan, stuff like that. Where it wouldn't necessarily untap during your untap step. You had to sacrifice lands to use them. Maybe they couldn't attack unless the opponent controlled an island. They had all these issues, but they were gigantic. And often they had other benefits like trample or penalizing attacking creatures or other things. So Doom of the Tolgath is a creature that's hearkening back to those old creatures, but still with a modern sensibility. So it's a 10/10 for 10. It has Menace, Trample, and Rampage 4. And because of the Menace, that means if the opponent blocks it, it takes at least 2 creatures. And that means it's going to be at least a 14/14 with Trample. It does not untap during your untap step. You can sacrifice a land to untap it, which that's a drawback, but at the same time, there is a number of cards in this set that tap things down and put stun counters on them. And Doom of the Tolgath, you can machine gun those counters off of this thing by sacrificing your lands. You know, someone taps Doom of the Tolgath and puts 2 stun counters on it. Well, sacrifice 2 lands, that gets rid of the stun counters. Sacrifice a third, you untap it. Now what? So it's secretly a little bit of a benefit in this set, where it's got stun counters running around. And whenever this attacks, each opponent sacrifices an artifact, a creature, a land, and a planeswalker. So it doesn't exactly have Annihilator, but it kind of has Annihilator. And in a way, it's nastier than Annihilator. This is a fun card. I love these giant old artifact creatures like this. This would be a fun one to like reanimate into play or pull it straight out of your library with like Trove of the Ancients, stuff like that, which is another card that's in the set. Labyrinth of Mirrors. Okay, so I have a confession. I do have a bit of a thing for mazes and mirrors. I think they're really cool. So combining the two seemed like a natural thing to do. Now I landed on this design eventually. 4 mana artifact. Whenever an opponent attacks, if they attack you, a battle you defend, and or a planeswalker you control, you create a 2/2 colorless reflection creature token. No matter how many things they attack with, or how many of those things they attack, you only get the 1 token per time an opponent attacks. I guess if they had multiple attack steps, or if they got extra combats, then the Labyrinth could create extra reflections at that point. So this is another card that punishes attacking, where the correct play might be not to attack at all, and just build up a huge board and come to a stalemate. And as I've said before, Wizards does not like to make cards like this. They like to encourage attacking. They don't like to encourage defense. But I think this card is fine. I think it's fair. So the first time someone attacks you, you've gotten a 2/2 for 4. That's nothing special. The second time they attack you, you've had 2 2/2s for 4. That's fair. You know, at least in limited, that's a good deal. Might not be a good deal in constructed. The third time they attack you, you've gotten 3 2/2s for 4 mana. That's when I think it gets up towards constructed application. Is if this helps you repel 3 attacks, or you get the value off of 3 attack steps, then you're really starting to get the value out of this card. So I think it's going to be a bomb in limited. I think it's going to be super powerful in limited. In constructed, I think the card is fine. You know, I think people can deal with like 2 or 3 2/2s. Now, if you've got other countermeasures, you got life gain, you got board sweepers, you've got these other methods of prolonging the game, then at the point that this is producing like 4 2/2s or 5 2/2s, then it starts to become backbreaking, I think, even in constructed. But you really have to push to get the card to that point. I think the card is fine. As I said, I think it's a bomb in limited. It definitely will change the tone of the game there, but once in a while, I think it's interesting for the game to go longer and for the opponents to see their late games of their decks come to fruition. This is more of a late game format, especially Wastes of Veldmar, but I think Defensive Veldmar is also a little bit slower of a format. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem to see people get up to 7, 8, and 9 mana and start making the ridiculous plays, playing the giant spells of the format. I think that's fun. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I looked at a bunch of the Eldrazi lands. I couldn't find one that did exactly what this one does. They do things very similar to what this one does, but not quite exactly this wording. So this can tap for a colorless. It can also tap for 2 colorless, but you can only spend that mana to cast colorless spells that cost 7 or more. So this is right in the vein of those other Eldrazi lands. None of them do quite what this one does, so it's probably fine. Maybe in combination with some of those other ones, it'll be too strong in the Eternal formats. We'll see. Or maybe we won't. Because this is, a set I developed, and maybe no one's ever going to play it that way. But a man can dream. This is Veldmar Vista. It's a rare land. It can tap for colorless, or you can tap and put a stun counter on it, and you add 1 mana of any color. So there are some old lands, I think from around Ice Age, that do this effect. And then in the original Kamigawa, like Champions of Kamigawa, I think, there was a cycle of uncommon lands that made 2 colors of mana that had this kind of effect as well. They didn't have stun counters back then, but it said it wouldn't untap during your next, untap step. This one makes all 5 colors, and it can also make colorless. It's a very good land in limited, I would say. It gives you access to the colorless cards, and it just fixes your mana for whatever you're doing otherwise. And I think that's worth the stun counter in limited. I know this isn't the most powerful land ever, but it's not always about making whatever is the most powerful. Sometimes it's about making something interesting. And I find the trade-off on these lands interesting. They have existed before. This is better than those previous versions. I don't recall one that made all 5 colors of mana. It's still not that powerful. But that being said, I think it might play well. It plays more interesting than a more powerful, straightforward card would. I hope you agree. And finally, I just wanted to point out I made some new art for the basic lands in this set. I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. So you've got this weird tentacle vine forest here, the island where the rocks have eyes, this freaky mountain that has these like multiple glowing eyes and eyes in the sky behind it. And it looks like it's all kind of like melding together in this weird way. This plains with these beautiful but very alien flowers and plant life sprouting in it. The swamp with some more disturbing little plant life. It looks kind of like little creatures growing in it. And then these wastes. And I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. So this would be like a Thune land here, where Thune's creating a realm of nightmare that's beckoning you in. This could probably be either one, either the Far Realm or Thune. This is like a normal waste here, with how Veldmar usually looks, how it made its own wastes. This is definitely a Thune waste with this crazy maze, this sort of MC Escher-esque art. And then this is definitely a Far Realm waste, where it's got this weird pink spongy life that's just sprouting up in this wasteland. That's definitely a Far Realm thing and not a Thune thing. That's what I wanted to talk about today. Probably the next video I do, we will start the card-by-card summary breakdown of the entire set. Starting with white, we'll move through each monocolor, then we'll hit up multicolor. Finally, we'll get around to colorless artifacts and lands. We'll talk about the limited format, have some thoughts on constructed, maybe block constructed. And I hope you all will be happy to go with me on this journey. If you are, or even if you aren't, please like and subscribe. Please check out my other videos. That one's the most important. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.